Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. Today's webinar, presented by ISPCAN Councilor Jordan Greenbaum, focuses on the scope and dynamics of child sex and labor trafficking around the world, including examples from a variety of regions and cultures. Dr. Greenbaum will explore vulnerability factors at different levels, the adverse health and mental health impacts of trafficking, the needs of trafficked children, and possible prevention strategies. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter your questions and comments in the chat box throughout the presentation. Dr. Greenbaum will answer any questions at the end as time permits. Jordan Greenbaum is a child abuse physician and medical director of the Global Health and Wellbeing Initiative with the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She is also the medical director of the Institute on Healthcare and Human Trafficking at the Stephanie Blank Center for Safe and Healthy Children at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She co-chairs the Human Trafficking Committee for the Ray Helfer Society and the Education and Training Committee for Heal Trafficking, an organization of medical professionals working on human trafficking issues. In addition, Dr. Greenbaum provides local, national, and international trainings on child trafficking and exploitation. Jordan, we thank you for being with us today and for your many years of dedicated work protecting children. Now I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. So let's see, show my screen. Okay, can you see my screen, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So anyway, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Jordan, and I'm really glad that you're here, and thanks for tuning in for the next hour to talk about child trafficking. This is really a passion of mine, and I look forward to your questions and your comments because I always learn a lot from that. So let's get going. I think we're all familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically what is most memorable for me is Goal 8.7, which says we need to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking, and secure the prohibition and elimination of the worst forms of child labor, including recruitment and use of child soldiers. And by 2025, end child labor in all its forms. And that's a laudable goal, and we're making progress globally on this goal. Today, we have much smaller goals. I'm hoping at the end of this talk that you'll be familiar with definitions related to child trafficking and the worst forms of child labor, and be able to recall factors that place certain children at risk for both sex and labor trafficking. We'll also talk about adverse health effects of labor and sex trafficking and end up with some potential strategies for prevention. So the human trafficking definition, as you may well be aware, is outlined in the United Nations Palermo Protocol, which originates from the year 2000. And essentially, there are three components to the United Nations Trafficking Protocol: an action, a means, and a purpose. So the protocol spelled out the definition of severe human trafficking and left it to every country that signed on to this protocol to develop their own laws related to it. So the national definitions vary somewhat from country to country, and that's why you see these sort of minor variations, because everybody is adapting their national law to meet this general protocol definition. The general definition essentially says that to show that human trafficking is occurring, you need to show that there is an action, a means, and a purpose. As you can see in these columns, it's almost like an a la carte menu. You have to be able to show that a person has been recruited or transported or transferred using means such as force, fraud, coercion meaning things like threats or blackmail, taking somebody's identification papers and not letting them go, for example, would be an example of coercion for the purpose of exploitation. And this can include sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery, and similar types of practices, or removal of organs. So there are three components. And again, you don't need to show all of this. You need one from each column. But since we're talking about kids, a very important process here is that according to the Palermo Protocol, if you're dealing with a child, and that is anyone under 18, you do not need to show the means, the force, the fraud, the coercion, the deception. It is often there. usually is there, but we don't have to show that because the child is not cognitively and legally able to consent to exploitation. And I think this is an important, a really important point, because if you think to yourself, well, in my country, my state, wherever you are, the legal age for having sex is 16 or 15, 17, whatever it is. That's not the same thing. A child can consent to have sex according to national law, but they cannot consent to be sexually exploited until they're 18. So I think that's a really big, important thing to understand. The other major definition that I want to cover is what's called the worst forms of child labor. And I find the various definitions of child labor very confusing. So I'm going to try to make it a little less confusing. The worst forms of child labor is a very broad definition that encompasses child trafficking and slavery, other types of sexual exploitation involving children in illicit activities like drug trafficking, and what is defined as hazardous child labor, which is work which by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out is likely to harm the health, the safety, or morals of children. So it encompasses, when you hear the term hazardous child labor, that's part of the worst forms of child labor. When you talk about the worst forms of child labor, you're talking about trafficking as well as other things. It's a big umbrella term. Another thing that I think is really important to emphasize is that human trafficking is not the same thing as smuggling. And I don't know about you, but in my neck of the woods, it's commonly misconstrued that they are the same thing. People often make that mistake. But it's important to know the difference. Smuggling is a crime against a country. Essentially, you're violating the laws of the country by moving a person across an international border against immigration law. So it's a crime against the country. It involves transportation by definition. And typically the person voluntarily enters into the agreement with the smuggler. They say, I want to go from Nepal to India, whatever it is. So they pay to do it. They want to do it. They get over the border, and in pure cases of smuggling, that's the end of the transaction. They've paid their money to do it. The smuggler goes on their way and leaves the person to do whatever they're going to do in their new country. Trafficking is a much different thing. It's a crime against a person. This is exploitation, illegal exploitation of a person, not a country. Transportation is not required, at least in some countries. In some countries, transportation may be a requirement, but in many countries it's not. And it involves the exploitation of the person for compelled labor, commercial sex. They're not transporting a person just saying, okay, now you go on your way. They're exploiting them. And it involves force, fraud, or coercion, or some other means if you're dealing with adults. And typically the exploitation continues if the person has been transported. It continues after the transportation and continues indefinitely. So they're very different. You may have smuggling that also involves trafficking. For example, if you had somebody who says, I want to be smuggled across the border of Mexico and the United States. So they pay a smuggler to get them across the border, fine. The person who paid the smuggler thinks they're being smuggled. They get to the other side, they get to the US turf, and they think they're going to be led on their way. But the smuggler has other ideas and sells them to a trafficker, for example, and then they get trafficked. So you can have the two occurring at the same time, but they are distinct definitions. One of the things that people ask a lot is how big a problem human trafficking is globally. And this is a very difficult question to answer because it's an illegal activity. Various countries, as I mentioned, have their own laws and their own definitions of what human trafficking is and vary in their ability to identify it. So it's extremely hard to get a good estimate, and we will never know the true numbers. But the International Labor Organization probably has the most accurate numbers, and recently they published a report estimating that nearly 25 million people around the world are involved in forced labor, which again includes trafficking. Of those nearly 25 million, about 4.5 million are children. Within that 4.5 million, about 1 million are estimated to be victims of commercial sexual exploitation as children. So that kind of gives you a gross number to think about, but keep in mind that's just an estimate. one of the things that makes this such a big problem is, as you know, that it is very high profit, involves very high profits and very low risk. If, for example, you have a woman or a boy or a girl and you are prostituting them, forcing them to be prostituted, and say you have to earn $500 US dollars a night, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, $500 a night will gross the trafficker over $180,000 that is tax-free. So it's extremely highly profitable. And you can traffic that person as long as you want. So it is a very high profit. And in many countries, there's very low risk for the criminals. The United Nations did a study and looked at criminal prosecutions in like 150 countries or so, and they found that 40% of the countries had fewer than 10 convictions during a 2-year period from 2010 to 2012, and 15% of them had no convictions whatsoever. So if you're a criminal and you're thinking, I can make a lot of money and it's not likely I'm going to get arrested, much less convicted, it makes it very appealing, which is really scary. Okay, let's go back to our source of the UN, because they're the ones that do the global studies. And this is the most recent data they have from 2016. And you can see that of the identified cases that they have, a little over 50% are adult women. Another 20% are adult men, and about 28% involve children, with girls more commonly identified than boys. Keep in mind, though, that this reflects the identified victims, and the data that goes into these estimates in this the study is only as good as the quality of the data coming from each country. So depending on the country where that you're looking at, there may be federal definitions that vary and maybe don't recognize certain types of trafficking, don't recognize labor trafficking as a crime, so it's not identified. They may not recognize boys as being able to be victims, so they don't recognize boys. They may be only looking for adult women. They may be only looking for labor trafficking. So it sort of depends on what the laws are and what people, the authorities are looking for is going to impact who they identify and what the gender makeup is for their population of trafficked persons. If you look at geographic variation in terms of the proportion of identified victims who are involved in labor versus sex trafficking versus other types of trafficking, you can see that the medium brown color on the left is trafficking for sexual exploitation. And you can see that in sub-Saharan Africa, this makes up about 30%, whereas it's a much larger proportion, the light blue, is involved in labor trafficking. And you see the opposite in Western and Southern Europe, where 2/3 of the cases are sex trafficking and only about a third is forced labor. Again, part of this is probably true geographic variation, and part of it depends on what people are looking for and identifying. And this data, by the way, involves adults and children for this particular slide. So let's look, who is at risk here? And I think the easiest thing to do is to think about risk factors or vulnerability factors from a socio-ecological perspective. And basically, as you may know, the socio-ecological model says, okay, there are certain things that make one person more vulnerable to, in this case, trafficking than another. But those factors may be ones that are individual, that is, are related to the individual per se, or they may be related to the family that the individual is in, or the community that the child or adult is in. And then finally, there may be societal risk factors that put whole societies at greater risk than other societies. And it's only if we look at these factors at various levels, individual, family, community, and society, are we really going to understand the drivers that push certain people into high-risk situations that involve trafficking. Let's look at a couple of examples, and so you keep that in mind that we're looking at multiple levels. So here's Ashi, 13-year-old female from a rural village in India. She's the youngest girl in a family of 8. Confucian principles are deeply held by this family. She's recruited by a respected village man who comes to the family and says, I'll take your child and take her to Mumbai to get work. And the family is all for that. They're desperately poor. They want her to support the family. Ultimately, however, the man sells her into a brothel in Mumbai. So let's think about her vulnerability factors. Now, this is a webinar. I'm not expecting people to write in their answers, but just think about it for a second. At the individual level, Ashi's at risk because what? She's 13, so she has the brain of an adolescent, which is looking for risk, looking to seek immediate gratification, looking for immediate payoff, and isn't able to weigh the pros and cons very well. She is also from a very poor rural village where poverty is a major push factor. So that is her whole community. That's at the level of the community, is that push factor. She is in a family that holds Confucian principles very highly. So this is a family risk factor in that part of Confucianism is the distinct roles of people within the family, and children are kind of at the bottom of the totem pole and must deeply respect their elders and support their parents, which puts children kind of in the place of having the least say in what happens to them and being responsible for supporting the family and parents. So she's got risk factors at multiple levels. Let's take another child, Hector, a 17-year-old male from a small village near Villanueva in Guatemala. As you probably know, Guatemala and several other Central American countries are rife with violence, gang violence, and other types of violence now. It's an extremely dangerous place to live, and many, many people are trying to get away. They're migrating north to escape the violence. 2 of Hector's brothers have been recruited by gangs or involved in drug sales. Hector's parents are very worried for his safety, especially since he has mild mental retardation. He's very vulnerable. The mother sees a newspaper ad, and it requests men for agriculture work in the United States. And this employment agency says, you know, apply now. We will help you get to the United States. You just have to, give us $2,000 US, which you can borrow from us, and we'll get a job and make sure that the person who takes the job gets a job in the United States, as a place to live, et cetera, et cetera. And the employment agency offers to obtain a visa and a passport for Hector and get him to the United States. They'll do everything. This is a one-stop shop. Of course, we have to assume that this is not going to work well. But for now, let's look at his vulnerability factors. Hector's 17, again, so he's young. He comes from a very small village. Again, poverty is a big thing. But in this case, violence is also a community risk factor that puts everyone in that community at risk. He is migrating, and we'll talk about migration as a major risk factor especially when there's mass migration. Hector has mild mental retardation, which makes him more vulnerable at the individual level. So all of these things make him vulnerable. And then finally, Terena, a 16-year-old female from Moldova who's been a victim of sexual abuse and long-standing family violence. She's done poorly in school and is eager to leave home. She's in a bar one night with her friends, and she's approached by a man who offers to take her to Italy to work as a nanny in a wealthy family household. And this guy is such a charmer. He says, oh, it's going to be great. You don't want to be at home. You're looking to leave. Come with me. I'll get you a good job, and you'll be in a great country like Italy. Well, what are Terena's vulnerability factors? She's 16, she's impulsive, she doesn't have the brain development to give her the executive functions that allow her to weigh the pros and cons, the risks and the benefits, and really have insight into her own vulnerability in this proposition. She's been a victim of sexual abuse, which is a major risk factor globally. People who have been sexually or physically abused or neglected are at elevated risk for sexual exploitation. And she's from a family where there is a lot of dysfunction and violence, which is a factor that kind of drives her out of the family and makes her seek her life elsewhere. And that also makes her vulnerable because she's looking outward for help and to get away. So you can see she's got multiple factors at various levels as well. So let's just go beyond our 3 examples and just review some of the individual factors that impact the particular victim. Gender is a big issue in general. Gender-based discrimination discriminates against females for most of the world. And so that is going to leave women and girls at risk because they have fewer rights, little respect, and fewer opportunities to support themselves. Children who are missing or living on the street are at extreme risk because they have so few resources. people without jobs, people with a low level of education, again, limited resources. Family factors, any family that's from a minority group, any marginalized group is going to be at risk, because just by definition, a marginalized group is going to have, people in that marginalized group are going to have fewer resources and fewer options. They are regarded with intolerance, pushed aside, and marginalized, and that makes them vulnerable. Extreme poverty, I think, is probably one of the biggest push factors for human trafficking in the world, both for labor and sex. Families, again, with violence, abuse, social isolation. That's all those kinds of things are going to drive people out of the home, be they adults in the home, like the mother, or the child. They're driven out of the home, and that makes them vulnerable. Communities where there's a great deal of corruption are very high risk. So if you have cities or even countries that kind of depend on trafficking, be it labor or sex trafficking, to finance their local economy, there may be a lot of corruption at the level of police or within the court system, and that's going to make it very dangerous for people who are living there. Anywhere where there is increased travel and tourism, be it resorts, small villages on the on the Ivory Coast, or Las Vegas, Nevada, for example, or Bangkok, or places where there are lots of business, Hong Kong, where lots of people are flying in for business. These are going to attract a lot of transient people, and that elevates the risk as well. Natural disasters are a major source of tremendous stress for an entire community. Everybody loses everything, and so everybody's in survival mode. They have very little. The police force is stretched very thin to prevent looting, and so this opens the door for the criminal networks to come in and set up shop, both for labor trafficking to reconstruct the area and also for sex trafficking. And then finally, societal factors. We've talked a little bit about gender bias, and certainly females are at risk because of the fairly global discrimination. But think about also that, in a sense, gender bias works against boys as well, and men, because in most cultures, the male is presumed to be very strong, very powerful, very protective. A male is not allowed to be a victim. They've got to protect other people. The man protects his wife, his mother, his daughter, his niece. He is not a victim. And so if a boy or a man is victimized, it's extremely difficult for them to come forward and disclose their victimization. And anyone who is hesitant to disclose makes them, they're at higher risk, because they make an ideal target for somebody. Economic disparities, mass migration, we're going to talk about that in a minute. These are all major societal factors. I want to talk just a little bit about migration, because that's such a big issue around the world. There are several areas in the world now where there is truly mass migration, escaping violence, war, etc. And those large bodies of people moving, seeking shelter, are at very high risk of trafficking. And there was a very good study that came out, I think it was last year, that looked at the Syrian refugee crisis and looked at factors that might increase the likelihood that refugees were being trafficked for labor and sex, and found that many of these vulnerabilities were present among the refugees, and all of these vulnerabilities raise the likelihood of any one child or adult being exploited or trafficked. And of course, they included things like poverty and debt. People may start out with a lot of money when they leave Syria, but they don't get far with that money, because they have to spend it to get across the border, and so eventually they run out of money, and so poverty drives them. Sexual and gender-based violence is very common in that area of the world, and very extreme. Anyone who is in a new country is going to experience cultural tension and resistance, especially in mass migration, when the host country is feeling the pressure of a new wave of people. Their language and cultural barriers, all of these things make it difficult for a refugee family and increase their risk of trafficking. And indeed, it is thought that there has been a significant increase in trafficking among the Syrian refugees, and probably with other refugee populations as well. Children who are involved in mass migrations are especially vulnerable because in many cases they're unaccompanied. They may be sent on their own, and lots of unaccompanied kids are sent from Central America to the United States on their own to get out of that violence, and they may not have a parent with them. So them being alone makes it very, very dangerous for them. Or they may start out with their parents but get separated at the border, for example. Then they're left without birth documents. They don't have identification. If you don't have a birth document, you're essentially a non-person. You can't get into schools. It's very hard to get care. It's very hard to get services. And so it makes it very difficult for children. They have a hard time getting jobs. And when they get jobs, they're paid extremely low wages. And at least for many girls, especially in the area of the Syrian crisis, early marriage is a form of exploitation and trafficking that is common, thought to be relatively common among refugee girls, because families are desperate to get a better life for the child. So they'll try to marry her off to somebody who has more money than they do and could keep her safe. Unfortunately, that sometimes doesn't work, but early marriage is another danger as well. Let's take a look now at the traffickers rather than the victims. The United Nations, again, did a study and looked at the typology of traffickers. And they came up with three types of traffickers that it can be. This model is a global model, and they're the small local operations, the medium sub-regional operations, and the large trans-regional operations. So let's break these down. The small local operations are kind of like the mom and pop grocery store organizations. It may be two friends and their cousin who get together and decide to sexually exploit and traffic their girlfriends or their other family members. Or they may recruit a few people in their community, but they don't have a lot of organization. They have no capital. They don't have a lot of investment, and so they can't make a lot of money because they only have a few victims, and they don't have the wherewithal to be able to make a lot of money and transport people long distances. So they tend to be domestic traffickers. That is, they stay within their own country, have a few number of victims, not very many people involved in this organization. And then you get to the medium organizations, the medium-sized ones, and they have still relatively few traffickers, but they have more. And so they have, since they have more people, they have more organization, they have a little bit more capital, they can get a little bit more organized, and they might be able to get people across a border, say from Nepal into India, for example. So they tend to stay within their region, maybe not within their country, but they're not going to transport somebody halfway across the world. They don't have the ability to do that. But they do have more than the small group people, so they get more profits and have more victims. And then, of course, there's the very large criminal networks, the gangs, the sometimes called snake organizations that are very sophisticated, have a very, very large group of people involved in a very hierarchical organization where nobody knows very much about the rest of the organization, so nobody can, give away too much if they're arrested. Everybody has their role. The recruiter, the manager, the transporter, the da-da-da-da-da. Everybody has their role. These are the people who have a lot of capital, a lot of investment, and they can be very sophisticated and move people around the world, and also often monitor what international and national law enforcement organizations are doing, so they can sort of put moles within law enforcement agencies to warn them if there's going to be a crackdown on human trafficking in some area of the world. So they are very sophisticated and can have enormous profits and large groups of people that are moved around the world. I want to mention that while the stereotype of a human trafficker is a man, it's not always the case, and that we have to be very aware of the fact that in many cases, traffickers are females. Traffickers may also be juveniles, or not necessarily adults. But female traffickers are not uncommon. If the UN study, they found that about 33% of the criminal prosecutions for trafficking involved female defendants, which is much greater than prosecutions for other major crimes around the world. In other major crimes, it's about 12% of the defendants are women. But with trafficking, it's a higher percentage. they typically are not at the top of the organization. So they're not the ones running the big criminal network, although there are a couple of ones in Nigeria, for example, that are run by women. But more likely, the women are involved in sort of the medium and low ranks. They may be recruiters, they may be managers. They're often former victims and may still be being exploited. Okay, enough of the traffickers. Let's go back to the trafficking and looking from the victim perspective. How are these children recruited into labor trafficking, into sex trafficking? How does this work? Well, of course, there's a tremendous variation, but some of the most common ways around the world are through smuggling that goes bad. You know, somebody thinks they're going to get smuggled and let go, and then they're not. But another really big one is job offers from fraudulent employment agencies that, like Hector, they run ads, they recruit people from villages and promise jobs, and either the job is not real or it's not anything like what they describe. So it's a fraudulent, deceptive recruitment technique that involves employment, which plays right into the extreme poverty of many of the trafficked persons. Familial trafficking is very common as well. Again, so it's not necessarily somebody from the outer circles. It may be a relative. Especially with sex trafficking, a false romance. Again, this is more deception. Pretending to be a boyfriend of a girl or a woman is one way of recruiting them and then sort of targeting them for the sex industry. Promising a better life. I'll take your child to the UK and get a job for her because she deserves to be able to go to school. So let me take her, and I'll take her to the big city, and she'll get work and schooling. And then there are some cases of kidnapping, coercion, abduction, which may or may not involve drugging a child and taking them away, but that certainly happens. Once these children are recruited, how are they controlled? Well, they're controlled in many of the same ways all over the world. Economic exploitation is one of the major ways of controlling somebody, and you can do that through debt bondage. Debt bondage is a manipulation that involves exorbitant fees and debts that are laid onto the trafficked person that are completely unreasonable and that they cannot pay off. So let's say Hector, I remember Hector from Guatemala. Let's say the employment agency said, well, you need $2,000 US to set all this up, and that's all you need. So the family, scrapes together $2,000. But then when Hector gets to the United States, they say, oh no, it's $5,000 because the transportation was more, and we've been feeding you along the way, by the way, and housing you. So then now it's $5,000, and the person can never get rid of the debt because it just keeps escalating and it's way, way out of proportion to what they can get. So what they can earn. So they are perennially in debt. That's debt bondage. You can also take their money and just refuse to pay them. And in many cases of sex trafficking, the trafficker is taking all the money. The victim doesn't get any money or gets very small amounts. Confiscating somebody's papers is a great way to maintain control if that person is a foreign national. Whatever country you're in, if you're not a domestic citizen of that country, you need your papers. And so if somebody confiscates them, it puts you in grave danger for being deported. Threats and misinformation are very common tactics. If you try to leave, I know where your home is in Guatemala, I'll burn your family's farm down. Or I'll go get your sister, or I'll put on the internet this video I took of you being gang raped. Those kinds of things. Misinformation is very easy for traffickers. They can convince Hector, for example, that he has absolutely no legal rights, that he cannot go to the police because the police in the United States are corrupt and he will just be deported and he has no legal rights anyway. So they can feed him all this information. He has no way of knowing that it's not true. In many cases, people who come across borders enter with legitimate visas and passports. They have their legitimate papers, but the trafficker may force them to overstay the visa. So for example, in the United States, you can come in with temporary work visas that are, I can't remember whether they're 3 months or 6 months. There's a specific time, but if the trafficker takes that visa and forces them to stay 9 months, now they're illegal. Now the visa is run out and they're at the mercy of the trafficker. Violence and psychological manipulation, as well as I do, are very, very prominent forms of maintaining control. Let's take a look at some examples of life as a trafficked person. And these examples are taken from papers that involve qualitative interviews of victims in various situations. So let's look at life on Lake Volta, where the fishing industry reigns supreme, and labor trafficking in the fisheries is a major problem. And this involves men as well as children, boys and girls. So we're going to take JM. He's a 6-year-old boy, and he was brought to a fishing village on the lake. He wasn't born there, he was brought there and forced to work. His day begins at 3 a.m. He gets up and he's forced to go fishing in the dark for 3 hours until the sun comes up at 6. He fishes long hours in the morning and in the evening. And when he's not fishing, he's farming or selling the fish. And when he is fishing, his job is to stand on these little unstable canoes and use a stick to make sure that they steer away from trees and don't hit trees. He's also, and this is the really difficult part, he's also made to dive down and untangle nets that get caught on rocks and trees. Now, some of these kids don't know how to swim, so their risk of drowning is considerable. Other kids may know how to swim, but they have no breathing equipment, and if they get their hand tangled in something, they may drown because they can't get up. They can't get out. It's a very dangerous form of work, and extremely long hours, lots of violence, lots of verbal and physical abuse. They're only allowed to sleep about 3 hours a night, and they sleep on the boat or on nets or wherever they happen to be. They're controlled via violence, isolation, and starvation. They complain, they get starved. They are denied adequate clothing to protect them from the weather. They have to fish in storms or in heat, and they don't have protective equipment. This is a very dangerous situation for this child and for the boys and the girls involved in labor in the fisheries. These children are also often victims of sexual exploitation, and the boys and the girls may be forced to have sex with people in the village as part of their exploitation. This next example is taken from the study that looked at the Syrian refugee crisis, and they describe a 17-year-old female. We'll call her LP. So she is from Syria. She and her family, without the father, he's nowhere to be found. She and her mother and her siblings fled to Jordan to seek refuge. And for unclear reasons, the mother left the 17-year-old there with this other woman that the mother knew, presumably a friend of the mother's. And the mother took the rest of the kids and went on to try to get to Lebanon. And as soon as she was gone, of course, the woman caring for the 17-year-old forces the 17-year-old to marry an older man who disappeared 3 days after the, quote, marriage. This is one of those things called temporary marriages or muta marriages, where you sell the child, they get married, they're used sexually for a given amount of time, then the groom leaves, no legal bindings, and the person who sold the child is free to sell them into another marriage. So every time this child is sold into marriage, the woman makes money. So she forced her to marry about 15 times, and even at one point forced her to have some sort of surgery to, quote, restore her virginity, because apparently the next husband wanted a, quote, virgin. So this is a tremendous sexual exploitation via forced and temporary marriage. And then finally, let's look at the situation in Tijuana, Mexico. MS is a 16-year-old female. She comes from a very poor village outside of Tijuana. She's sexually abused by her father for 2 years as a child when she was 10 to 12. She has had a lot of long-term problems associated with that sexual abuse. She ran away from home at one point and repeatedly ran away to try to get away from all that. She lived on the streets, moved to Tijuana, lived on the streets there, and began using illicit drugs as part of the street scene. So you can see how many risk factors she's got built up here. She engaged in what we call survival sex, that is, exchanging sex acts for things that she needs: food, shelter, money for drugs, money for clothing, that kind of thing. It's called survival sex. Very common among street kids and runaway children. She engages in that because she has to. She's being sexually exploited. She becomes pregnant. She had an induced abortion and eventually met an older man who became her trafficker. So this is her story. She had tremendous trauma all the way to the point where she ran away, and then had more trauma when she was being exploited and eventually trafficked. Well, if we look at these 3 kids and look at others who have been trafficked and exploited, what are the health consequences here? They are major. Let's look at our 6-year-old boy in the fishery. He risks injuries from electric fish, which can sting you or bite. I'm not sure what they do, but they transfer electric shock. He can have diving accidents. Think about this: 4 a.m. in the morning, he's standing on the canoe trying to look for trees to steer away from. The net catches on a rock, and they demand that he dives in and frees the net. So he dives in, but he lands on a tree stump head first as he dives in. Tremendous injury from that. Near drowning. Violence from his, quote, master, who wants him to work harder, longer. He's also very vulnerable to various infections, such as schistosomiasis or bilharzia, which is a parasite that causes a lot of bladder and kidney problems, and other infections. If we look at our 17-year-old girl from Syria, she's very vulnerable to sexually transmitted infections, HIV, AIDS, unwanted pregnancy, and traumatic injury from violence. The 16-year-old girl from Mexico, also at high risk of STIs and HIV, pregnancy, drug abuse, etc. If you look in general, and there's a lot of research done on the health effects of labor and sex trafficking, physical and sexual violence is rampant, so all kinds of traumatic injuries, chronic pain from old injuries. People often get a lot of chronic pain as well as a psychosomatic complaint. It's their body's way of dealing with stress, is to have the sort of migratory pain, back pain, headaches, stomach pain. Pregnancies and abortions, and many abortions are not done by people who are qualified in using sterile techniques, so they may have botched abortions and die of post-abortion hemorrhage or infection. STIs, we've talked about, HIV rates very high. But consider also the emotional toll that this takes. Rates of post-traumatic stress disorder have been measured as high as 75% in groups of survivors that have been tested. Suicidality and depression is very common in one group of survivors of sex trafficking, adolescent survivors in the United States. 47% of them reported trying to kill themselves in the last year. This is a very, very traumatized group of children. And many are involved in using drugs and alcohol. Sometimes that's the predisposing factor that makes them vulnerable to trafficking, like our last child who started using drugs on the street. But in many cases, the drug and alcohol use is either fostered by the trafficker as a way of controlling somebody, or the victims themselves will take drugs or drink alcohol to self-medicate. They're so stressed, they're so miserable, their lives are so awful that they seek to escape some of that stress by taking drugs. If you look at labor trafficking, we have a lot of untreated chronic medical conditions and a lot of work-related injuries. People who are involved in, say, cleaning or agriculture where there are pesticides. They are not given gloves or protective equipment, so they may get chemical burns. They may inhale a lot of toxic fumes and have a lot of lung problems. People working on construction probably don't have hard hats. They don't have harnesses to keep them from falling 10 stories. So they may experience a lot of work-related injuries that are preventable, but because they don't have the safety equipment, they get traumatic injuries. And then a lot of chronic pain and overuse injuries. Significant weight loss from malnutrition, very common because the living conditions with labor trafficking are often horrendous, and so they're not fed well. They're in very unhygienic, bad living conditions that pre-exposes them to infections like tuberculosis and diarrheal infections. Keep in mind also that in labor trafficking, you often see sexual exploitation too, and this is not just with girls, it's with boys as well. So there may be all the sexually transmitted infections and HIV and pregnancy issues that you see with sex trafficking. I want to point out a particularly grim statistic, but this is not unique to India, but in areas of the world, there are many areas, as you know, that have very high rates of HIV AIDS. And a study was done of sex trafficked women and girls in India, and they studied, I think, 3 different cities in India and looked at the rates of HIV positivity, and they found that the youngest trafficking victims were the most likely to be HIV positive, with kids less than 15 years of age had a 60% positivity rate. That's incredible. It's almost 2/3 of kids in that age group were HIV positive. Just incredible. So the younger kids were at very high risk relative to the older victims. And there are a number of hypotheses that look at, well, why would young kids be more vulnerable to HIV? Why do they have such high rates? People suggest that part of that is physiologic. The immature genital tract on girls renders them more likely to be vulnerable to the HIV virus sort of penetrating in and getting into the body. They may be more likely to have sex with HIV positive men who have the folk belief that if you have sex with a virgin or sex with a child, that'll somehow cure your HIV. And a lot of people believe that, so they have sex with a child. Children maybe are valued more in brothels, so they tend to be hidden more, and so they may end up being trafficked for longer periods of time before they're able to get out, and that may elevate their risk as well. Longer duration in prostitution was a factor that was associated with increased HIV rates, and for whatever reason, being in Mumbai as a trafficking victim yielded an elevated risk as well. Keep in mind that HIV/AIDS is bad enough as it is, but it also increases your risk of other really bad infections, namely hepatitis B for one thing. Tuberculosis can be much more aggressive if you're also HIV positive. You may wonder if victims are able to seek health care, and I think that there are studies in some high-resource countries that suggest that in many cases they are able to seek health care, but I don't think we should make that assumption globally, because I think there are lots of areas in the world where they have very limited access, and especially children. From the research I'm doing and what I've been able to look at the research of others, I think there are lots of barriers to access, and so many children especially don't get health care. And there are barriers such as not being allowed to leave the brothel. In most countries, commercial sex involving a minor is illegal. So the brothel owners don't want their kids to be found out. They don't want to take those kids out of the brothel to take them to the hospital. The trafficked persons may be afraid to seek medical care, even if they could, because they're afraid that hospital personnel will report them to police and they'll be deported. They, in many cases, and it's been documented over and over and over all around the world, people are afraid of the negative discrimination, bias, and harsh attitudes exhibited by healthcare providers when people do come for healthcare. I think that's a really important thing to be aware of. The cost is also an issue. Long wait times, just ridiculous transportation issues. It's very hard for somebody who's being exploited at a gold mine to travel all day long to get to the nearest village, where they then sit for the next day waiting to be seen. If a person wants to leave exploitation and they're had the opportunity to do so, they really face a lot of challenges. For example, they're going to need interpreter services and immigration assistance, as well as legal advocacy, because they are in general, if they've been taken across the border, they're in a foreign country and have all sorts of immigration issues. Whether they're domestic or a foreign national trafficking victim, they're going to have lots of needs, including housing and food and emotional support, lots of mental health needs, as we've seen very high rates of post-traumatic stress and depression. They'll need life skills training, job training, so they can get something other than succumbing to re-trafficking circumstances. If a person decides to stay in their new country, they've been brought from I don't know, let's say Nigeria to Italy. They decide they're going to stay in Italy. They're integrated into the new country. They're going to face the language and cultural barriers, as well as, very likely, discrimination as a minority person, a minority group. And if they've been trafficked in sexual circumstances, they may be labeled as a, quote, prostitute. They're away from their family, friends, and support. So they have a lot of challenges. Over and above all the usual challenges that migrants and others will have. If they decide to go home, back to Nigeria, then like all likelihood, they'll encounter the very same problems they left: extreme poverty, family dysfunction, family violence, plus, added on top of that, community and family ostracism because they didn't make the money they were supposed to. Two, they may be seen as a quote prostitute and a tainted person. So that a lot of times there's even more discrimination, even more problems back in their home country than they were when they left. And unfortunately, in both situations, integrating into a new country and reintegrating into the old one, the rates of re-trafficking are quite high. I want to talk a little bit about how you might work with a trafficked child or youth in the last 10 minutes or so. Keep in mind that anyone who's been trafficked has been through a lot of trauma. And so we need to acknowledge that trauma and take that into account. A traumatized youth needs a trauma-informed approach to care. And this is not just to medical care, this is to any care when you're talking to any traumatized child, and especially trafficked children. The reason is, if you think about it, trauma really has an impact and changes the views of the victims, their views of themselves, their views of other people, their views of the world around them. It has an impact on what they expect of others, how they interpret what people are saying to them, how they interpret facial expressions, their attitudes towards you are all impacted by the trauma that they've experienced. They will say things to you that are influenced by their own experiences. Their behavior will be impacted. And this may be as a result of one severe episode of trauma or many chronic episodes of trauma. Kids who have been trafficked have learned over and over and over that they are worth nothing. The only thing that they're good for is fishing or having sex, that they do not count, that the world is a very hostile place, that nobody is there to help them, nobody cares about them, and they are on their own. So that has a tremendous impact on their self-image and the way they behave towards other people, the way they see the world, the way they interpret what you're saying to them. And this is going to lead to specific behaviors. People who have been traumatized often have emotional difficulties, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, like nightmares, for example, like anxiety attacks, like being triggered by reminders in the environment that trigger trauma memories and make them feel really anxious or upset. They're often very withdrawn or depressed. They may be very hyper-vigilant, always looking around them, always expecting danger because they live in a world of danger. They may have hyperactivity and not be able to pay attention. A lot of traumatized children do very poorly in school because they just can't concentrate. Their minds are spinning with trauma triggers, memories of trauma, other things, and they just can't concentrate. So they're all over the place. Aggression, distrust, these are all behaviors that are associated with trauma. So when we see a child who has any of these behaviors, and we know they've been trafficked or know they've been traumatized, we have to think to ourselves, why are they acting that way? Every behavior has a function, and we need to figure out what that is. So ask yourself, is this child being aggressive because they want to maximize their chance of survival and keep themselves safe? Are they being aggressive and hyperactive and in your face because they want to get your attention and so they don't feel so lonely inside? Are they trying to make another connection with somebody and this is the only way they know how? Is this person being very hypersexual around you because that's the only way they know how to engage somebody? Do they need to act very cocky, very self-assured, very sort of arrogant because they need to feel in control? Are they telling you lies about themselves because they need to believe that themselves? What's the function of their behavior? Well, how do we respond to these behaviors? That's the thing. You say to yourself, well, this child is acting this way because they're afraid. So what do I do? Well, one of the ways you can respond is to try to make them feel safe. Wherever you are, however you're talking to them, whether you're in your office or out in the field or in the hospital, take steps to make them feel psychologically safe. Interview them alone or in a safe, private place. You may need a chaperone, but don't interview them with the person who is with them, a family member, whoever is with them, because you don't know who that person is, whether they're a trafficker. So interview them in a private place. Practice this very empathic listening where you make good eye contact, you're really concentrating on what they're saying, and you repeat back a few of the words that they say just to show that you're listening. Be very non-judgmental and open. Don't be exhibiting disdain or horror or blame, because that's what they're expecting other people to do, and we don't want to fulfill that negative expectation. Be very supportive. And I think one of the big things is to try to understand from the child's perspective the way they see things and meet them where they are. If a child says, this guy who's trafficking me is my boyfriend, I love him, he looks out for me and he wants the best for me, it's not my job to say, no, it isn't, kid. He's looking out to exploit you. He's getting you on your back, trying to make as much money as he can. That's not going to get me anywhere with that child. The child's just going to say, you don't understand, and tune me out. I need to say, tell me more about him, what you like about him. What name do you call him? And I call him that name. Tell me what you like about him. How did you meet him? Are there things you dislike about him? Are there things you like about him? So you're meeting them where they are, and that helps build a sense of safety and trust. We want to provide explanations for everything we do, and this is a sign of respect. If you know you're going to ask 25 questions, it's a good idea to say, I want to ask you these questions because why? Because I need to know something about you, to know if there's some way that I might be able to offer help. That's your explanation. If you're going to take them someplace, tell them why, so that they feel that they can predict what's going to happen, because their lives have been totally unpredictable. And that feeling of being out of control is a very, very stressful thing and makes them feel very stressed. Try to get their consent whenever possible and respect that consent. Is it okay if I ask you questions? You don't have to answer them. Is it okay if I do a physical exam? You get their consent. Be very transparent. If you know that you're going to have to, as a mandated reporter in your country, you have to report to the police something that they're about to tell you. You need to tell the child that before you start asking a lot of sensitive questions. Otherwise, you're betraying that confidentiality later. So it's very important to talk about the limits of confidentiality early on. Demonstrate respect through your active listening. Empower the child at any time you can. How do you empower a child? Offer them choices. Offer them control. Do you want to sit in this chair, or do you want to sit on the couch there? Do you want to talk here or over here? Do you want to have the drapes open or closed? Do you want to have me examine you, in the case of healthcare providers, with your clothes on or with a little robe? Would you like something to eat? These are all ways of giving the child choices and making them feel empowered. Ask their opinion. In the healthcare provider case, I'll say, I think it would be helpful for me to give you some antibiotics in case that you have something called gonorrhea. And this is why. What do you think about that? What do you think would be the best thing to do? And so you're asking for their perspective and their opinion. Recognize that they're experts on themselves. I don't know this person. They know themselves better than I do, and we need to recognize their role as experts. Validate their strength. Thank you for telling me this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for, being so helpful during this interview and answering my questions. And focus on resilience. These are survivors, and we need to focus on their courage, their strength, that they've survived these traumatic experiences. They are not thinking about that. We need to focus on that so they become more empowered themselves. And encourage shared decision making. We want them involved. We don't want to be telling them what we're going to do. We want to get them involved so they're helping to make their own decisions. Okay, just to conclude, international trafficking is a tremendously complex problem with multiple root causes, as we've talked about. The physical and emotional consequences are severe and varied, lots of varied possibilities. Victim needs are extensive, and unfortunately, in all too many countries, really all countries, the services are relatively limited compared to the need. If you have any questions and want to know more, we have an Institute on Healthcare and Human Trafficking, which you should feel glad to go to visit the website. Also, ISPCAN has great resources on their website, so I would encourage you to do that as well. The bibliography is here in case you're interested, and you're welcome to download this information in case you need to get in touch with me. My email is here, and I would definitely be interested in answering questions either now or later. And as I mentioned, ISPCAN has a lot of good resources on trafficking as well. So that is my talk. I'd like to hand it back over to Heather.
Okay, thank you very much, Jordan. Hold on just a second. Okay, So we are at time, but I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of questions. For those of you listening, if you need to leave us now, please know that a recording of this will be available on our website for members by tomorrow. So you can listen to this when you are able. So Jordan, we had a couple of questions about migrant and immigrant children and families and the risk there. I'm going to kind of combine a couple. One person was asking about in the U.S. the current policy of separation at the border and kind of the risk for these children in detention facilities. And then someone else was asking, in crossing border situations, if there are successful prevention programs for trafficking.
I think these are excellent questions, and I think the whole issue of separation of children at the U.S. border is extremely traumatizing, and is a form of, it's a form of child abuse. You're traumatizing the child, taking them away from their parent. So I think it adds to the tremendous trauma. And if any child is in a detention center anywhere in the world, they're going to be at increased risk of exploitation because they are much more vulnerable in those situations. So yes, I think that adds to the problem. In terms of prevention, that's an extremely important thing. And people have talked about what's the best way to prevent labor trafficking. Well, we can't just tell people don't migrate from your poverty-stricken community, because they're going to have to migrate. They have to eat. But what you can do is try to educate people about their human rights and their basic legal rights. If you know that everybody in this community, for example, is typically being recruited to work in Kyrgyzstan, in construction, for example, that's the common place where people go. You could go to that community and say, look, these are your legal rights in Kyrgyzstan. If you do this, this is what the law says. This is where you can get some help. You need to have somebody in Kyrgyzstan that you can rely on to look out for you, a family member, a friend, or something. This, you can give them information so that they know what their rights are and they know some of the risks. Can we prevent it from happening, trafficking? No, but we can help people be them more resilient. We can educate families, educate kids about recruitment techniques that people use, especially in rural areas when they're recruiting families with very little experience with big city techniques, so they may be manipulated. We can educate them about recruitment techniques. And often, I think probably the most important thing would be to provide people in villages, people in towns and cities with skills so they can make a living themselves and aren't vulnerable to having to migrate and become vulnerable to trafficking.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question.
Yes.
And you just addressed a little bit about rural versus urban. Someone asked about the difference for risk between rural and urban, and how the internet has affected recruitment efforts.
These are such great questions. I think that they're certainly living in rural parts of the world tends to be where there's a lot of poverty and a lot of weather conditions and droughts and stuff that can drive whole communities into migration just to stay alive, and that puts them at tremendous risk. But you also have a lot of risks within the city of the desperately poor in the city. So I think the people in both areas are very high risk. It's not one or the other, but certainly the massive move from rural to urban places to get jobs feeds into that risk of trafficking. I'm sorry, I forgot the last thing. God, I just talked too much. What was the second part of that?
Let me see. Oh, the internet, how the internet has affected.
So it's thought that the internet has increased trafficking considerably. You can use the internet in a lot of different ways, and the globalization has made it easier to reach people and recruit and manipulate and traffic people way out in areas of the world where they used to have very little communication. So, for example, what we used to call sex tourism, or trying to buy children and go travel someplace to have sex with a child. And more people are going to foreign countries and going into rural areas now because they recruit using the internet. Traffickers recruit on the internet. They can lure people in and offer jobs, offer romance, start relationships with the internet. So it's a very powerful way of accessing people for recruitment, as well as for actually selling and buying through trafficking.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jordan, for sharing your insights about this critical topic with us today.
Sure.
And thank you, everyone who's listening, for your questions. And again, to Dr. Greenbaum. To let you know, a recording of this webinar and a PDF version of the slides will be available on the ISPCAN website by tomorrow. We encourage you to become a member of ISPCAN so that we can continue having informational webinars like these in the future. If you are interested in presenting or have ideas for topics on our webinar series, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. Thank you all again for your time today, and we hope you have a good day or night, depending on where you are.
Thank you.